Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be featuring the Petropavlovsk, the recently released Soviet Tier 10 heavy cruiser. And oh man, does it bring a whole new meaning to the concept of heavy cruiser. Armor-wise, in classic Soviet fashion, the armor is excellent across the board. The deck armor is 50mm, the upper belt armor is 50mm, and it even has a 50mm icebreaker that covers the lower part of the nose. This all combined, of course, means that you are very resilient against both HE and AP. You do, however, have a fairly large nose, that is 25mm. Basically, the upper part of the nose above the icebreaker is vulnerable to pens and being farmed. Note that also the back of the ship, almost all the way to the rudder, is protected by 50mm plating, including a 180mm plate protecting the rudder. The rest of the stern is 25 as well. But ultimately, in terms of tankiness, you have a lot of armor, especially when angled. If caught broadside, the broadside armor is 180mm, but it's actually layered armor. Behind the 180mm plating, you have armor on the citadel as well. Underneath the turrets, you have 120, and underneath the center of the ship, you have 40mm of plating. Which means that, well, in order to citadel you under the turrets, you have to punch through 300mm of layered armor, and under the citadel, 220mm of layered armor. The citadel deck is also 80 to 100mm, so highly unlikely that there will be any random overmatch citadels on this ship. In fact, in terms of tankiness, very tanky. very tanky, to put it quite simply. The health pool sits at 55.8k, which is also a notch above most. I would say compared to Des Moines that sits at about 50, it is a notch above it. The torpedo protection is 19%, which isn't exactly impressive, but then on the other hand you are a cruiser which rarely gets as much torpedo protection as something like a battleship. The concealment is actually excellent on the ship, 11.7 kilometers, which considering the ship is in terms of length fairly large, is pretty impressive. Even more impressive is the fact that the air detectability is somehow only 7 kilometers. This combined with the AA range being 6.6 means that most of the time if a plane wants to spot you, they're also flying into your AA. And the AA is actually quite powerful. We'll get into the AA a bit more later. There's also a lot of synergy with the fact that you have 12km radar and 11.7k concealment, but also something we'll get into later. In terms of maneuverability, the turning circle is actually dreadful, 990 meters, so very much these Soviet tanky cruisers with the poor handling. The rudder shift is 9.7 if you run the module, and the speed is 34.1 with the flag, so not actually that fast as many others. But what should and probably needs to be discussed is the guns. The guns on the Petropavlovsk are on a completely different level to any other guns in the game. They have so many features going for them that it just, well, you will see plenty of examples in this commentary about the power of the Petropavlovsk guns, but they are incredibly efficient, especially at mid to long ranges. Petropavlovsk's weakness is the fact that at long range the dispersion is poorer, and this is something I think will limit it greatly in any terms of competitive, especially right now with carriers and long range basically being what decides the effectiveness of a ship. But in random battles where you fight more at mid and short ranges, this ship is brutally effective. The AP then. Well, actually, I should mention one thing about the turrets. All three turrets on the Petropavlovsk are 360 degrees, even the front turrets. So that means that if I wanted to turn my guns to my left side now, I could literally turn them straight through my ship without having to turn my ship around. This, especially when this helps alleviate the issues of the poor turning circle quite significantly, because, well, you rarely actually need to turn your entire ship around. You can just swing your guns straight through your turret and continue firing. Nevsky giving far too much broadside, as they often are. The AP then. The AP is, in a simple word, magical. You have the improved penetration angles, which have kind of become standard on most of these Soviet guns. You also have the short fuse. We'll get into that a bit more later, but what it means is that you have the Stalingrad fuse on the shells, which means that even though you have incredible shell velocity, your shells still consistently arm and you can consistently citadel without overpenning. You also have an incredible shell velocity. I think was it 995 meters per second, and these shells have basically very little air drag at all. This of course means that these guns also have some of the best penetration in the game, well, especially for a cruiser. In fact, if you want some examples, here is two cruisers known for exceptional good penetration, the Moskva and the Henry. And then there is Petropavlovsk penetration in comparison. It's pretty obvious who's the standout cruiser. In fact, you can even compare it to the Alaska, and the Petropavlovsk penetration will still leave the Alaska far in the dust. The only one that can really compete with this thing in terms of penetration, if we're talking cruisers, is Stalingrad and Kronstadt. Everyone else is hopelessly outmatched. And this means you can pull off a lot of silliness, because, well, for example, I mentioned that if you have good pen guns, you can easily bully Jean Bards, and, well, that's exactly what we're seeing here. Well, you can bully a lot of battleships that have flat turret armor, because if they try to push this thing, well, just like you would against the Des Moines or something similar in other cruisers, you can do it to battleships in the Petropavlovsk, and that is consistently just break their guns as they try to push in towards you. And this Jean Bart is indeed not a very happy camper, because I have just consistently gone through both his turrets and permanently broken them. That close range dispersion, that incredible penetration, he had no chance. And then I switched to the other Jean Bart and blepped him for a classic 15k. He has, however, loaded the Nemesis, which is a cheat and does take me down. Situations like that, however, highlight just how powerful this ship is for random battles. The combination of incredible firepower and incredible tankiness, combined with what is a surprisingly great concealment of 11.7, means that you can push up and you can create these crossfires that they don't expect, and you can basically throw out almost battleship grade AP at anything you're crossfiring. In fact, the best comparison for these guns in terms of penetration is Bismarck's 380mm guns. So these Soviet 220mm guns have roughly the equivalent penetration of Bismarck. So this means that any crossfires, even on, in this case, in Montana, that's 10 kilometers away, giving me broadside, can easily be citadeled consistently across the board. For once again, not something that would be as valuable in something like a comp, but in random battles, this ship just feels like an absolute monster. It is really, really fun to play for this reason, but in terms of balance, I really do have to question it. Because you also get so little warning about the arrival of the ship thanks to the great concealment. And you have to remember that because this thing has Stalingrad's extremely short fuse, unlike other great pen guns that suffer from overpens, you can still consistently citadel, well, ships like Smolensk that usually are incredibly difficult to citadel. So, consistency, effectiveness against all targets. This ship is just made to bully random battles in my book. Oh, aimed a bit low. Moskva is no angling against the Montana, but I'm creating the crossfire by pushing into the cap, so obviously he's gonna get absolutely shredded here. Now, there's another aspect of the tankiness that I haven't really gotten into that I probably should, and that is the height of the ship. Namely, the freeboard of the ship. This ship sits absolutely stupidly and ridiculously low in the water. We're talking nonsensically low in the water. I've compared it, I tried to compare it to other cruisers, and I realized no other cruiser like even came close to Petropavlovsk level of basically waterline lack of freeboard, to put it simply. No other ship really came close to the lack of freeboard. Oh, here you actually get a pretty good example of this improved penetration angles, which synergize so well with the AP because it's got such great velocity and such great pen. When you have improved pen angles on top as well, even angled cruisers, seemingly almost impossible angles like this angle, this Moskva seems quite well angled, and you gotta remember his belt isn't that thin. Absolutely no issues even citadeling him from this angle, so just the guns from mid to long range are monstrously powerful. But no, what I was talking about was the freeboard, and that's something that really needs to be highlighted. I mentioned that I literally couldn't find a cruiser that had similar freeboard to the Petropavlovsk. So going into the training room, I actually compared it to destroyers. And this is probably the closest freeboard that I could find matching it. And that is gearing. That is a destroyer. And if you compare the freeboards, you can see that, well, I think the gearing might even be a bit high. No, I'm not sure. They're basically pretty close. This is in the ballpark that we are moving when we speak about Petropavlovsk freeboard. This thing sits absurdly low in the water, and obviously this is nothing but a huge advantage when being shot at from range, because the citadel and the broadside and the ship in general is just so much harder to hit. I was going to end this clip, but there is another good example here, besides just the AA. The ship actually has pretty decent AA at 6.6 km range, as mentioned. It throws out 8 flak, I think with 90% accuracy on the flak, and it has a mid-range of 4 kilometers that deals 261. So not exactly a poor performance there either. No, what I also wanted to highlight here is the long-range gun performance. Whereas it lacks consistency, you gotta remember you still retain the penetration. And it's not like the vertical dispersion is bad either, so even on ships like Venezia, that is, what, more than 17 kilometers away, you can pretty damn consistently, almost every volley, just citadel punish him. And you can do this against, obviously, all cruisers in the game, because the penetration is more than capable of pulling it off, and with the improved pen angles, it's a bit more forgiving if they angle slightly against you. So, this ship is by no means completely powerless at range either. That's just exaggeration. It struggles at longer range because the dispersion is less forgiving, especially the horizontal dispersion, but obviously it can absolutely still punish ships across the map. And finally, I should probably highlight one of the things I actually dislike the most, which kind of has to do with the concealment of the ship, and one of the reasons why I run RPF. You can absolutely trade RPF for fire prevention, don't get me wrong, but the reason I run RPF on this ship is because the concealment is 11.7. So the Petropavlovsk, just like the Tallinn and just like the Riga, can stealth radar. This is especially brutal against other cruisers, of course, because, well, you can just radar cruisers pushing in, and then if they try to disengage, that AP really brutalizes them. But it's equally powerful against DDs. I really don't like this. I don't think it was necessary for the Petropavlovsk to be able to do this. In fact, I don't even know why they had to make these new radars 12 kilometers. If they really insist on these ships having this concealment, then they should have reduced the radar range. Because the problem, of course, with stealth radar is always that there is pretty much no counterplay against it, because you can't spot the ship until you're already within radar range. That is always going to be the downside. I don't like it, but that's why I run RPF, because when you run the radar module, you do in fact get just enough radars off. In fact, you bump up the radar duration to 18 seconds, which is, especially with RPF, with your guns already turned towards the target, is more than enough to radar, shoot, reload, shoot again, so you always get those 2 shots off on any target. Vladivostok gives me broadside, he thinks there's no battleships here, so he can actually make the turn, but Petropavlovsk really doesn't care about his armor. For random battles, I think this is an absolute monster. For competitive, I think it's going to struggle, because especially now when the carrier meta, well, carrier meta basically, carriers being forced upon the players, there is long range is what matters. Venezia's and Stalingrad's. The one, it does have some benefits though. Well, generally if you want a short range AP powerhouse or like holding corners, then you take a Des Moines. If you want the long range one, you take the Stalingrad. And I'm not really sure how Petropavlovsk can really bully either one out of those positions, because Stalingrad is still significantly more consistent at range than this thing is, and Stalingrad also has better pen, and the differences in DPM aren't really that significant. There are some advantages, however, to the Petropavlovsk, namely the fact that not just is the AA great and the concealment much better, but it's also less vulnerable to AP bombers than something like the Stalingrad. Namely, Stalingrad Citadel basically covers the entire ship. It's from broadside to broadside. It's one big flat huge citadel, very easy to hit with AP bombers. However, Petropavlovsk has that layered armor protecting the citadel. The citadel is actually just in the center of the ship, so in terms of size it's probably half. In terms of wideness, it's half as narrow, so not quite as vulnerable. However, that does not mean that you won't get citadeled if you get dropped. It just means it's harder for them to pull it off. This, of course, does make random battles more enjoyable though, because if the carrier isn't that good, it's no longer just enough to just drop the general direction of the ship like versus the Stalingrad. They actually do have to hit the very center part. For Brindisi, giving too much broadside. You see this a lot in randoms, and this is one of the reasons why the ship is so damn powerful. It consistently punishes people who give broadside. And with the level of play we're seeing in random battles these days, obviously the Petropavlovsk is going to shine, and I've had a lot of fun with it. Make no mistake, I highly recommend this ship. I think it's so much fun. You get this insane penetration. You get an incredibly, like, look how low this ship sits in the water. You get this incredibly low sitting, hugely tanky ship. You can push in against basically any ship you feel like. You can push in against DDs, smoke cruisers, because you have radar, hydro. Carriers, if they're tier 10, they will absolutely be able to strike you, but tier 8 carriers do struggle with your AA, because as I mentioned, it is quite effective. You have 360-degree turrets, so if someone pops up on the other side, your turret traverse is fairly slow, but you can turn your guns straight through the ship. The armor is great. Most of the HE will shatter unless they pen 50 millimeters. It's great in every way. By far, the guns are the selling point of the ship, and yeah, Petropavlovsk absolutely gets my recommendation to grind. There's a lot of really questionable magical stuff that I wonder about, like how does a 220mm shell outperform Bismarck 380mm guns? How is the ship even able to float sitting so low in the water? Why did the concealment need to be so good? Why can it stealth radar? How is the air concealment lower than on ships that have a lower mass than this thing has? I don't really know. Only Wargaming can answer that question. But ultimately, Petropavlovsk, absolutely worth grinding. I think there's a fair bit of horseshit here, but hey, that hasn't stopped wargaming before. Let me show you guys my recommended build for this ship. Right, as always, starting off with the equipment. I really don't like this new equipment menu. I think it's more misleading than the old one. Regardless, upgrade-wise, turret survival. Your turrets are incredibly tanky, but you also spend a lot of the time just sitting nose in eating battleship AP. So improving that tankiness doesn't exactly hurt. Radar duration, so you can get off 2 shots, especially with RPF when you can already pre-aim your guns, so all you need to do is press radar and shoot twice. Synergizes extremely well. Better dispersion on the main guns, faster rudder shift, acceleration could also be an option here, considering the turning circle is quite constricting regardless of if you use this or not, whereas acceleration might help you juke long range shells by basically accelerating, stopping, reversing and so forth. Better concealment and faster reload. No point running range mode on this ship because, as mentioned, long range dispersion is very poor. So rather have that mid to short range power instead of trading it for honestly some rather weak long range power. Flag-wise, well, consumable-wise, I did say hydro. Flag-wise, run the fire chance flags, reduction in fire, better heal, better speed. I would say faster consumables and AA, because as also mentioned, the AA values are quite strong on the ship because the AA range is so good as well. Captain build-wise, if you do have Kuznetsov, he's always the best captain you can run on basically any ship, not just Soviet ship. If I could run this on any ship, I'd run it on any ship because he's just so good. Priority target, Adrenaline Rush, Superintendent, Concealment Expert. That is the base build. After that, Expert Loader, absolutely. The reload is, well, I wouldn't say long, but the reload is a fairly hefty 11.4, so being able to switch ammunition type faster is quite nice. I personally really like RPF. I think it synergizes great with the stealth radar, which is kind of busted, but I think it works really well. However, if you do feel that you're being burned to death and you would want additional tankiness, fire prevention is a very viable option on the Petro, as the ship is already so very tanky that fires end up doing a fairly large percentage of the damage you take. So switching RPF for fire prevention if you feel you need more survivability is, in my opinion, a perfectly viable build. I do like the faster turret traverse because the turret traverse, especially with the reload mode, is very sluggish. 37.6 is not particularly fast for a cruiser. It makes up for it a bit with the 360-degree turrets, but it's still very slow, and I think Expert Marksman is kind of must-have. And finally, the last 2 points into the improved Jack of all trades for faster damage con, heal, hydro, radar, basically everything you need. So works very, very well. Overall though, the Petropavlovsk is a very, very strong ship. I think it will somewhat struggle for competitive because, well, especially right now, it's all about long-range performance, which the Petro does not have. However, for random battles where you can just push in and cause havoc with an incredibly tanky ship that basically packs an insane punch, Petro seems really, really good. To be fair, I would have liked to play some more games in this ship. I think I've only played 13 games, 14? How many have I gamed? Let me double check. I have played 13 battles in the ship, so I absolutely could play some more to get a better feel for it, but I don't feel like it's changed too much in terms of playstyle from what we tested back in the day when we could still actually test ships. It feels very, very similar, and for random battles it just seems very strong at what it does. Overall, highly recommend the Soviet line, highly recommend grinding here. The Tallinn is, in my opinion, one of the best tier 8 tech tree cruisers. The tier 9 is also some of the best. The Riga is fantastic. At tier 8, the only competition would maybe be something like a Baltimore. At tier 9, I don't really know what tech tree really competes with the Riga. It is very good. And Petro is absolutely a fantastic random battle cruiser. Some questionable things here, as mentioned, concealment, freeboard, armor, penetration, but also some things that just it doesn't make a lot of sense, because back in the day Wargaming, for example, told us that air concealment is decided based on the highest point on the ship. So this ship that has 6.6 km AA somehow also has an air concealment of 7 kilometers. But for example, someone who suffers a lot from planes, for example Venezia, well, it sits lower, it has a lower mast, but the air concealment is 1 kilometer more. How exactly does that work? Well, no one really knows. No one really knows how that math works out, but hey, the Petropavlovsk is here, it's too late to complain, and it is most certainly a dangerous, dangerous ship. One more example of the freeboard, I might as well quickly highlight the Goliath. Where is actually the Goliath? There we go. Yeah. I'm pretty sure you can basically fit 2 Petropavlovsk on the freeboard of 1 Goliath. Why was it necessary for the ship to sit so low in the water? I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that if the smallest possible wave actually hit the Petropavlovsk, this ship would sink. But hey, this is a game, so we don't need to worry about small details like that. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys later.